Now, why are we here today to talk about this topic? I think essentially because somebody put it in the framework agreement. The framework agreement has a provision that says the peace process will address the legitimate grievances of the Bangsamoro people, correct historical injustices, and address human rights violations. That's what we know as of now about transitional justice in regards to the Mindanao peace process. There has not been yet much discussion beyond what is in the FAP on what exactly are we going to do with transitional justice. So that is sort of why this is quite relevant. It is a sort of new concept to the country. It will be an important part of this process, and there has not been much discussion about it yet. And as anything else related to the peace process, while whatever is discussed and agreed at the panel level is very important, unless there's a sort of ownership and participation in society at large, not much will happen. And my intention today is essentially to focus on two fields, the why and the how. Why is transitional justice important, or why is it probably coming to be important in the coming months? And how? How do you do transitional justice? What is it really about? Why do people do transitional justice in peace processes? First of all, it has become, over the past 20 years probably, a standard procedure in international peace building. And related to that, the multilateral system, the UN system, has reached a point where UN agencies cannot be involved supporting directly a peace process if there's not a mechanism to avoid impunity. There's an institutional reason of working on this. In a context of war and deteriorated governance and trust, working on transitional justice is a mechanism to bring back civic trust, meaning trust between citizens that have been divided by conflict, and trust between citizens and the state, the horizontal and the vertical trust. And there is a social reason as well, which is the importance to provide some sort of closure, healing to traumatic experiences as a precondition, looking back in a healing way as a precondition to be able to look forward with reconciliation and a future, a common future across all divides. This is, in a nutshell, why transitional justice is present in most peace processes in the world. Now, all of these reasons are based on one and the same assumption, which is there is no lasting peace without justice. What I would invite you to do with this and any other assumption is permanently and constantly critically reassess that. And is this broad assumption true to your context, to your experience, to your hopes, to your expectations? Most often, the components of transitional justice are, you differentiate three core pillars: truth, justice, and reparation or compensation. Truth and the truth commissions became famous with the case of South Africa. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu, was probably the first big structural effort of a country to come to terms with its violent and conflicting past in an effort to move forward as a nation. Justice. Historically, conflict termination has ended with the rule of the victor. One side wins the war and the other one loses, so the victor puts the conditions of whatever happens. And either the opponents, they get killed or they get imprisoned, or for whatever reason they make an amnesty or they make an agreement to have some sort of power sharing arrangement, whatever. So a precedent, maybe an early mechanism, I'm not sure if you could call it transitional justice, but of a tribunal that was trying to look at the most heinous crimes and provide some sort of justice and reparation to the victims was the Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War. So there's a formal way of proceeding justice, and with the tribunals, Cambodia has maybe a closer experience to you in your context in Southeast Asia. Bangladesh tried something recently, and we'll come back to that when we also look at some of the risks and the difficulties. But then, of course, you can follow the formal ways of dealing with justice. You can in some countries, there are deeply embedded customary practices that would allow you to do this in some ways. Maybe one of the most famous cases was Rwanda in the Gacaca courts. You had, again, millions of people who had been displaced and killed, and very clearly a number of perpetrators. How are you to provide justice to all of these millions of victims in a very short period of time? So that's the second leg, justice. First, truth. Second, justice. Third, reparation. And reparation, again, can take place in different ways. It can be monetary reparation. It can be other sorts of material reparation. It can be symbolic reparation. The Congress passed a law earlier this year providing reparation for the victims of the Marcos dictatorship. And then there's a very important one, the symbolic. And the symbolic has very much to do with apologies, public apologies, state apologies. We as a state did something wrong, we as a society did something wrong in the past, and take responsibility for that, even if it's symbolic, sometimes beyond symbolic. It was not right to discriminate against the black in the US. It was not right to how we treated the Aboriginal people in Australia. It was not right, and so many other apologies that actually are increasing. You get apologies, if you look at it closely, almost every month in one country or another. From Germany to the Czechs. There's an outcry in South Korea for the Japanese to apologize for what they did with their sex slaves. It is very important in many contexts, and that's therefore another way of providing reparation. So, components: truth, justice, and reparation. And this sort of closes the first idea I wanted to share with you: the why and the what. Why do you do it? Why is it normal in peace processes to deal with transitional justice? And what is this all about? Now, that's what we know sort of in theory or conceptually. The more important thing is how? How do we do this? How do you balance the need to put a stop to atrocities and at the same time hold those responsible hold the responsible for atrocities accountable for what they did? So unless there is pressure from society and from institutions, not much will happen. And pressure does not happen at the negotiating table. It comes from outside. And it has to come from civil society organizations, from academic institutes, from other bodies, national and international. In any case, I think, and many people think, that principles and approaches on transitional justices need to be guided by the victims themselves. Because it is about restituting their rights. And not only because they as individuals carry rights, but because by doing that, society can regain or increase trust in the state and its institutions as really being able to deliver to what they are supposed to be there for. Let me just frame to our context in the Bangsamoro what's going to happen now. The provision in the FAB that mentions to transitional justice will be discussed, is starting to being discussed in the technical working group on normalization. They haven't agreed on exactly what to do yet, but most probably the way to start, because the panels themselves are aware there are many ways you can deal with this, is that they will do some sort of initial assessment. They know they have to do it, they know that they want to do it, they don't know exactly how to do it, so let's create a body that will make an assessment. What's the lessons learned, the good practices and the bad practices internationally? What's the lessons learned of what we have tried to do in the past in the Philippines? What are the expectations of the people? Talk to the victims. Are they really expecting that whoever ordered the massacre in whatever mosque in the 70s still has to be held accountable? Do they really want to know what happened in the siege of Jolo in 72? Whatever. People have to talk and say what to expect. And then, based on that, I assume they will come up with some sort of recommendations. Customary justice may play an important role, as it did in Rwanda. What can it do? Will it do in the Bangsamoro in the Philippines? Probably. To what extent? And is there maybe a Bangsamoro / Filipino way of dealing with justice? And some people have been suggesting we tend to be a people that are sort of forgiving, but we also tend to remember. So yes, we may forgive, but not necessarily completely forget. So maybe is the concept of memory important in this context? And if memory is an important concept, how can you work on that so it's able to deliver its purpose? Or is it something different that nobody has articulated yet and can be articulated? How have they done in the neighboring countries? Nepal is discussing its Truth Commission right now. But what is happening in this discussion? First, it is sort of a response to some sectors of victims organizations telling, hey, you cannot just forget about this, and B, the UN system there as well. But again, the core political and armed actors are not necessarily that interested in committing and working seriously on this. And the problem is, they cannot even agree right now on who will sit in the commission. And the discussion on who will sit in the commission is triggering new political debate that is opening up wounds that in one way or another were sort of, okay, it's part of the past. And now, because you create expectations that something will happen, you're actually opening up those wounds, trying to heal them soon, but in that process, the very process itself is sort of damaging, at least the way they're handling as of now. In Cambodia, the risk of institutionalization. Yes, let's create a tribunal with international judges, local judges, supported by the UN system. Of course, millions of victims of the Khmer Rouge, blah, blah, blah. The trial is it's soon being finished. They're trying 2 people, 70 and 80 something. They were trying a third one who died of old a few months ago. It has been very difficult to put this tribunal to work. It has taken them years. The budget is about $1 million every year. So it comes to a point where they do this because it has to be done. But from what I understand from my friends and people in Cambodia, people don't feel they're this is detached from their realities. And therefore it's difficult that it serves the purpose. And it's a waste of money. Well, waste. I don't want to call it a waste because I think a tribunal is important. But from some people's perspectives, given the multiple needs, it is a huge investment of money. And the question is, could this same amount of money have been spent differently to provide transitional justice? Open question. And I think the risk in the Philippines, at least from the past, is the risk of neglect. Don't do anything. Or the risk of cosmetics. Pretend you do something, but nothing really happens. Or very little really happens. So there is a question that's coming up time and again about effectiveness. Does it work at all? There's a risk even asking that question, because if you start asking about effectiveness and you see it doesn't fully work as expectations would be, some people might say, well, then just let's not do it. Well, I think, no, you cannot put it that way. It's like the justice system doesn't work very well. But is that a reason for not having a justice system? No. You just have to try to make it work better, right? Same with transitional justice. It's not fully working probably anywhere as people would like it to work. Is that a reason not to work it? No. It's a reason actually to put more efforts into try to make it work better. So some questions that may be relevant to ask for the context in the Philippines and in the Bangsamoro. On the truth, justice, and reparation. How much truth can you get? And maybe a recent example is a good reminder of the challenges. Zamboanga tragedy. I call it a tragedy. It's not an incident or it's not a upheaval. It's a tragedy. And of course many people blaming each other. Whose fault was it? Christians telling it was the Muslims. Moros inside them, no, it was a MNLF faction. No, it was this faction. MNLF saying, but yeah, that wasn't our goal. It was actually the government because what they did, that they misunderstood and then they triggered the conflict. Mayor saying it's OPA because they haven't been around, they have mishandled. Everybody pointing at each other. Will we ever get the truth of what happened in Zamboanga? Is there one truth of what happened in Zamboanga? Okay. This is something that happened just a month ago, 2 months ago. Now, if we are dealing with the past, do we think we'll get the truth of what happened in Holo in 72? Or other massive episodes of mass violence perpetrated by multiple sides? Will we ever get the truth to that? So how much truth can we get? At the same time, should not this encourage us from seeking the truth and getting as close to the truth as we can? Because I think many of you work on land issues. I have the impression most people in the Philippines still think that the peace agreement with the MILF is a concession of the government towards the Moros. They don't see it as a step necessarily for the strengthening the democratic institutions of the country. In other words, what's good for the Bangsamoro, it's good for the Filipino. They see it as a concession. And why? Because in the national worldview and narrative, there's still not enough information of the whole process of minoritization and land dispossession of the Moros in their home, in the territory. It's very deeply embedded in the Bangsamoro narrative. It's not in the national narrative. And unless it gets into the national narrative, it's very difficult for the rest of the country to understand this is not a concession. This is just a way of building a stronger nation of the Philippines that caters to its people and takes responsibility for things that have been done wrong in the past. On justice, how much justice can you expect? nobody knows for sure, if I'm not mistaken, who was the mastermind behind the assassination of the father of the current president. Nobody has been held accountable for that. Will somebody ever be? It's just a reminder of, if we look at the past atrocities, and again going back probably to 70s, is the president cannot make anything to have justice for the assassination of his father. What justice can you honestly expect for things that happened to a peasant 30 years ago? And yet, looking at the closer episode, I think unless the state is really able to deliver some credible and serious justice for something like the Ampatua massacre, I mean, that's very symbolically very, very, very important. Because if the state cannot respond and hold accountable for what happened only 4 years ago, such a huge, massive atrocity, the credibility in the state as a provider for security and for justice it's in a very, very bad situation. And if you want to build peace, peace is essentially about building, strengthening governance institutions and the democracy. And so that is a very strong test, I think, for the state now to be able to deliver for that. And I think very important for the peace process in general, because if they cannot, then it will be difficult to expect something else in terms of justice. If they can, then there will be some hope that other mechanisms for justice can be taking place. Third one, how much reparation can the state actually deliver? If ever there will be some sort of looking at what happened in the past, the land issue will come up. Now, how should it be dealt with in a way that doesn't trigger new conflict or create expectations that the land that was taken from my grandparents, we will get it back, or something like that? Because at the end of the day, the biggest risk maybe of the whole process of transitional justice is it's walking on a very thin line. And if it gets it right, it's the assumption that it's a very important and powerful tool to heal wounds of the past and move forward. But you can so easily get it wrong. And instead of healing and moving on, you dig up the shit from the past and trigger new conflict and new violence. So that's why it is so important to think very carefully on how you want to do this. So let me end with throwing out some questions to you, to think now and to carry with you when you go home. What is the purpose of doing transitional justice and the peace process in Mindanao? How much truth, justice, and reparations is needed or possible? What sort of truth, justice, and reparation respond to victims' rights and expectations, which may not necessarily be the same, and to the needs of society? How long back should a transitional justice process look at? 2008, 2003, 2001, 1996, 1976, 1968, 1945, 1899, 1521. And final question, which I already asked at the very beginning. What is the Bangsamoro / Filipino framework of transitional justice? And nobody will tell you. You will have to find the answer to that and advocate for that, I believe. Thank you. you.